And now we'll hear from Professor Lindsay Lowell from Georgetown.
Okay. Good morning. Steve asked me to look at computer scientists. There's really not any great data on that. So I put together a presentation that is hopefully touches on relevant issues and is also, unfortunately, a bit of an echo of what we heard yesterday and a little bit this morning. And Graham Hugo basically summed up my point, which is it's not about numbers, it's about the best and the brightest. That is, if we're talking about competitive policies in the context of the United States, I think too much of the focus is really about numbers, not enough is about selectivity. And the United States is, not to put too much of a fine point about it, it's not really about skilled migrants, it's about STEM workers. And it's not about STEM workers, it's about STEM workers with graduate degrees. So the policy debate is very, very nuanced in the United States relative to other places. Now, does the United States, going forward, do we have a restrictive set of situations? Well, what do I mean? Well, people say we have a restrictive regime. Do they mean our policies? Well, I'm not sure our policies are as restrictive as they are kind of incoherent. And it's an important difference, right? It's an important difference. So, for example, among things that have changed the last decade, how we process certifications in the United States has changed fundamentally. We've cleared out the backlog. It's much more efficient. Not what it should be. And we can all argue about what the value of certifications, generally speaking, but at least the idea is there. So policy, a little bit incoherent, but how about the numbers? Are we really restrictive if you think about the numbers? What does it mean within 2 decades, within less than a generation, for the proportion of PhDs in the United States to go to double to 50% foreign born? What does it mean for the proportion of master's degree holders to go up 30–40% in the same period of time? Is that what restriction looks like? It does make you wonder, what does restriction look like when you're looking at those kind of proportional changes? Now, a lot of this is beside the point for those who want to argue for more numbers, because it's really about the exploding pie argument. And we heard a little bit of that yesterday, which is the idea is you bring in foreign born, they create demand, derived demand, they innovate, and that creates everything builds. Well, maybe. I'm favorably disposed to that argument, but at the same time, how far can you extrapolate from statistical models with given elasticities in a given equilibrium state? Does it really hold to talk about wide scale or huge increases? In other words, what I'm going to discuss here today is fairly straightforward. The principle that we use to construct our policies. And a dozen years ago, when I said what we want is generous and selective policies, not more and easier visas, I got a lot of blank looks. Now, this audience gets it because it's been pretty much discussed here already today, and Leslie Ann was pointing it out earlier as well in the previous panel. Selectivity is really a difficult thing to do correctly. At the same time, it's kind of curious that within the last year, when I make the same kind of argument about the principles we use to construct our visas, I've had very hostile reactions. And so that's the tenor of the debate in the United States, too. Numbers is a proxy for so many other things than just deriving good policy. So, and we have a lot of problems in the United States I'm not going to focus on, which is how you make your policies, what systematic policy. I mean, you can increase the employment base, but then you got the family side to deal with. I mean, we got huge problems in the system as a whole, not just simple single visa reforms. So, do we have competition? Well, certainly to get this to work, I'm competing with myself. Here we go. You've seen this. I'm focusing here just on, overall responses to this UN survey. You've already seen some of this. And what we know is that most nations in the last, few years are saying, yeah, we want to raise overall immigration. And in European countries, which I'm seeing as our major competitors, right? And that's a mistake, because there's a lot of competitors, both for migrants within other Asian and other countries, but also those countries that are producing more and more students want to retain them. So the competition's all the way around. Nonetheless, what you can see, North Americans, that'd be Canadians in the U.S., don't seem to be really wanting to raise their highly skilled migration numbers, whereas Europeans do. But that comes with a lot of caveats, doesn't it? We know the UK is in a different boat. Sweden's really moved aggressively. Singapore hasn't. Denmark's doing something different. So our different competitors are really moving in different directions that something like this doesn't really tell us too much about. But to make the point again, this is something that's way out of date, did a decade ago. I ranked major visa policies in competitor countries on the degree of openness with the United States. And I did it upside down just to confuse people. So down at the bottom, Australia has the more competitive policies for attracting high-skilled migrants, permanent in this case. Italy has the least. This is a dozen years ago. Things have changed. But the basic point remains the same. The U.S. does not have, on 7 different criteria for attractive policies, a particularly attractive policy regime for bringing in skilled migrants. You could do this with temporary migrants. We look a little bit better primarily because of the H-1B, but we still don't have a particularly attractive policy regime for bringing in skilled migrants. At the same time, what I'm going to be talking about next is we seem to get a lot of migrants. So not a really attractive policy regime, but we still get a lot of migrants. As Jean-Christophe said yesterday several times, we tend to dominate the market for highly skilled migrants globally. First, looking at students. Richard Freeman showed us yesterday that we've seen a real boom, an exponential boom in the number of students abroad in STEM. And that's what it looks like. Here's another place. This is what it looks like as well. And in this context, you have to wonder what it means when people talk about evidence of restrictive policies in the United States when they say we're losing market share. So over the last decade, we've gone from about a quarter of the international student marketplace to about an eighth. What does that mean when the number of students has gone from 500,000 to over 800,000? If we were to retain our share of an expanding enrollment of international students, the number of students in the United States would grow very, very rapidly. Do we have the capacity? Can we deal with the issues that Australia dealt with? So market share, I think, is a very tricky concept to deal with in this world, but it also is kind of important to know that, in fact, we are in a competition. So this is a little bit of an old analysis I did, but I think the facts probably still remain the same. I looked at about 100 countries in terms of their enrollment patterns domestically and the number of visas from that country to the United States. And what I find is that, sure enough, as enrollments in tertiary education go up in a source economy, they send more migrants to the United States. Not too surprising, the supply is there. And as enrollments of, say, Indians in the United Kingdom went up, they sent fewer Indian students to the United States, about a 10% reduction, in fact. So there is competition. You can see it in the data. But the other part of the story, which I'm repeating, is that policy effects are small. That is, visa rejection rates have a fairly small relative impact on the number of students coming into the United States relative to GDP differentials and these enrollment factors. So there's, again, a lot of things that drive migration to the United States, and policy is just one of them. And in fact, the United States receives a lot of the international flow. Using the best data we have for 1990 and 2000 and data that's not been released yet, that Jean-Christophe has, we know that 2/3 of the college-educated migrants in the world ended up in the United States in 1990 and 2000. So what does that look like today if we retained our dominance? Well, in terms of international students, this is just another look at it. We have the biggest number of international students. Look at this also. We have a large proportion of them who graduate in STEM. So we're pretty successful in that as well relative to other countries. A couple of caveats here. one of which is, what else are they doing if not STEM? And by and large, they're doing business, right? So that's the other big area of enrollment. So Richard Freeman yesterday was saying there's a competitive advantage to having a lot of STEM graduates and STEM workers. There's also an argument by a business prof up in Columbia that where research takes place doesn't really matter. It's the companies that bring it to market and where those monies go that matters. So we spent a lot of time thinking about STEM, probably a little too little about business and the kind of business infrastructure and the kind of business education that allows people to actually take advantage of ideas and bring them to market, which is pretty important. And the implications of international business students are probably equally important to those of our STEM students that we're looking at here. It's a completely different world in some ways. This is a data set I was able to get access to for 20 leading countries of destination. The basic line here is you can see that growth in the overall numbers, which we want to return to in terms of our thinking about this process. So there's a huge growth in international tertiary migration volume. At the same time, the U.S. still tends to dominate, and that hasn't changed all the way up through this decade. This is WIPO data, so it's looking at patenting data. And what you can see is that the greatest volume of international named patents by people from different source countries end up in people moving to the United States. Patent data, people don't like it, right? Patent trolls, over patent, other industries don't report their patents. I don't think it would change the story here pretty much. The U.S. still remains, in terms of this measure of innovation, a mecca. Well, we have what we were talking about yesterday, which is international authorship of scientific papers. Well, scientific papers have their problems too, right? An idea is not a product. Nice, but it's not a product. And we know, if anybody's been, I don't know, if anybody is as dismayed as me, raise your hand. With the recent reporting on the problems of fraud and misrepresentation in professional publication, it's pretty widespread. Having said that, both scientific publication and patents have their problems, but they both show the same thing. The United States still remains pretty much the centroid. There's a nice set of figures in this same publication. Imagine, if you would, back in 1990, this same dense graph being only about a third as populated with lines and interconnections. So the interconnectivity of the world has really grown as well. The United States, at least to this point, still remains central. Well, okay, for the short-term future, how do we stack up against our major European competitors? Well, certainly in terms of broad-based measures of a knowledge economy and a knowledge-based workforce, this measure shows that the United States, again, is pretty much in the lead. It does have a little bit of computerized information there, but it's too small to see. No, the researchers don't even show. The broader point is that we have a large workforce. So a large workforce also means a large infrastructure for doing this kind of thing. And the likelihood is that puts you in a first-to-market position. And I imagine that's where we're going to stay in the United States for some time, at least in the immediate future. This is another way of looking at it. These are researchers as a share of total employment. The United States is right up there with Japan. Coming out of nowhere, very interestingly, is South Korea, and the Russians are losing. Again, the U.S. has a sizable share of its workforce that's engaged in high-tech activity. This is a kind of an indicator of our capacity to be competitive going into the future. And here's another thing to consider, which is wage change. So you can kind of forget the bottom half of the graph. We're not really in competition with Romania or Latvia. Probably not. But these other countries, United Kingdom, Sweden, Germany, these countries are seeing rates of change in overall, and particularly in STEM earnings, that's not really markedly faster than the United States. Now, the United States has had fairly flat STEM wage growth over the last 5 or 6 years. In that regard, these countries are doing better, but it's still not huge growth. All I'm trying to say here is we've got a couple of things to think about. Huge growth in potential supply abroad, balky policies in the United States, yet continued market domination of the IT workforce as everybody is getting into the game. And in the immediate term, I think we're still pretty well positioned against our European competitors. Now, what I wanted to do was try to get at some measures of selectivity, which is kind of important, because that's the message here, right? On numbers, we're doing pretty well. How well do we do in terms of selectivity? And that's really much, much harder to gauge. If you look at measures of underemployment, the U.S. does pretty well. We saw that a little bit with Jean-Christophe's presentation yesterday. If you look at unemployment rates and employment rates of the highly skilled, the U.S. does really well compared to most European countries. So on those metrics, those are the things that are really attractive to migrants, I think, that they can come and get a job and stay. And we have, in fact, fairly high retention rates as well in the United States. So on those measures, we're doing really well. But this is Jean-Christophe's paper from a decade ago. It's changed a little bit. But basically, if you're below the line, then the foreign-born share of college-educated that you have in your country are less educated than your natives. To me, that means you're not particularly selective, right? The whole goal is to bring in migrants that are highly selective, if anything, at least, if not better educated than the native population. Our competitors, Ireland, Canada, Great Britain, Norway, which does remarkably well on these kinds of measures, Australia, all are, in fact, bringing in workers that are highly selected. They're better educated than their native population. Here is the WIPO data as well on immigrant share of patents. So we talk about how immigrants are differentially patent prone in the United States. In fact, if they're in the STEM world, they're probably not much more likely to patent than natives. But on an international comparison, the United States, in fact, does not seem to have foreign-born that patent at extremely high rates compared to, say, the UK, Belgium, Canada, or some of these other countries. So in at least two kind of crude measures of selectivity, it's not clear that the United States really does bring in super selective migrants. And in that regard, and related to students, I'd only point out a couple of factors as well. One of which is William Kerr's colleague has found that the master's premium for foreign-born students in the United States has evaporated. That is, if it used to be the case that if you got a degree in the United States, you'd get a premium for it. That's gone. And we know, for example, from NSCG data, that foreign-born students working in the United States earn 40% less than other workers. Okay, well, it's a trainee program, right? But that wage hit continues as they carry on into the next job. If we look at H-1B data, we know that H-1Bs, a non-negligible proportion of whom change status from an F visa, earn 5 to 10% less than natives in the same occupation. The real premium for H-1Bs are those who are selected from abroad. So we have these selectivity challenges that are going on. What are some of the other selectivity challenges? Well, globalization works against selectivity of the best and the brightest. Numbers work against the best and brightest. I was trying to put together a graph at 1 a.m. last night, and I failed. So, but I do know that if you look at the proportion of professionals who we bring in among the family and overall immigration in the United States, as the volume of migrants from a country goes up, on average, the proportion of professionals goes down. I'm working with H-1B data, currently the petitions data, and if you look at the relative within occupational earnings of immigrants, the ratio to natives, or actually to the occupational average, there's about a 10% premium for H-1Bs. All H-1Bs on average earn more than the average within an occupation. But as the number goes up of H-1Bs, that premium goes down. So every 10% increase in immigration of H-1Bs, new H-1Bs that you bring in, there's about a 5 percentage point down pressure on their relative earnings advantage. This is fairly obvious. As we know, that SAT math scores stabilized and dropped in the last decade. Why? Because people suddenly got stupid? No, because the number of people taking the math SAT test went up. So as the numbers went up, the average overall performance went down. So there's a challenge when you bring in larger numbers to ensure selectivity. Let's look at a couple of what these things are. So this is how the globalization thing works. When you have restrictions, when you have barriers, selectivity goes up. So over time, what Hunter et al. Found is that the proportion of Nobel Prize winners in the United States has gone down over time. They argue why? Because globalization has made travel easier, barriers to travel have gone down. It's gone down. If you look as well at the proportion of STEM PhDs in the United States, you can see that we're admitting a lot more PhDs now than we are getting Nobel Prize winners. This is just the forces, intrinsic forces of globalization. They change the nature of global selectivity. I talked about the numbers game, and this is the final point. The United States faces a lot of issues in putting together a competitive STEM workplace, not the least of which is, as Paula Stefan can tell us, the nature of R&D funding in the United States has changed radically, and as it changes the nature of production of domestic students, and arguably it changes how wages are paid out, especially as businesses have moved heavily into development instead of basic research and changed the nature of demand for labor. It's putting downward pressure on wages, and you can see this here. This is you can see the Sputnik moment. That is, STEM workers earned a lot more than a market basket of occupations they'd rather have had back in 1960, but over time, the STEM advantage has gone down. I'm not going to pull this apart because I want to finish up and allow you all to have some time to ask questions. So these are the challenges going forward. Expanding numbers abroad, globalization, which changes the nature of selectivity, and a domestic marketplace which is changing. So the challenges to getting the selectivity question are really, really substantial, and nimbleness is going to make it an additional problem for the U.S.